The name that means excitement is back. Bond. James Bond.
That girl must be very talented.
Shut up.
Believe me, my interest in her is purely professional.
What is this?
I've had a few optional extras installed.
Wherever he goes, adventure follows.
Two of our men are dead. Koskov's named you.
Then I must die. Eliminate him.
Kill him!
For 12 years, Roger Moore entertained audiences worldwide as James Bond, the 00 agent with a license to kill. Although his films were more mixed in critical reception compared to those of Sean Connery's, they still remained popular and well-loved by fans decades after their release. But after being involved in the role for so long, it was time for a change, and Moore gracefully retired from the role after the release of A View to a Kill in 1985. Following this, Albert R. Broccoli began the search for a new actor to play Bond for the first time since the 1970s. An extensive search led to numerous actors being considered for the role, including Sam Neill and Pierce Brosnan, who was actually signed for the upcoming film, but was forced to drop out after NBC renewed his TV show Remington Steele for a new season after exercising a clause in his contract. Damn, that's gotta sting. The search came to an end when Broccoli decided to hire Welsh stage actor Timothy Dalton, and production commenced in preparation for a 1987 release date. Dalton's arrival would usher in a new, though short-lived era for the Bond franchise, as it began with a bang in the form of one of the most memorable films in the franchise, The Living Daylights.
He lives for danger. Lives for the moment. He lives on the edge.
Whoever she was, I must have scared the living daylights out of her.
James Bond, 007, The Living Daylights.
The Living Daylights is another story named after another one from the works of Ian Fleming, though as with most other films in the franchise, the story in this one is entirely original. It was initially conceived as a prequel to other films in the series, though this idea was scrapped in favor of being a traditional film altogether. As with Roger Moore's first film, Live and Let Die, The Living Daylights would also prove to be a turning point for the franchise once again in terms of its presentation. By the mid-1980s, media outlets had begun to regard Bond as being old-fashioned and out of date, with particular attention given to the number of women he'd been seducing over the years. By this time, much of the world was in a panic due to the ongoing outbreak of HIV and AIDS, and it was thought that Bond needed to settle down with one woman instead of being with multiple. Additionally, most critics and even audiences had begun to tire of the campiness generally associated with Moore's decade-plus tenure, and wanted a more serious style of Bond this time around. Broccoli took the feedback to heart and worked with his team and new Bond actor to create a film that I feel is the best Bond film of the 1980s. How so? Well, let's go ahead and take a look.
Something we're making for the Americans. It's called a ghetto blaster.
Before we begin, it's important to take a look at the new leading man of the series. While I really enjoyed Roger Moore's performances as Bond, even I have to admit, after reviewing all these movies in order, that it's nice to see someone new this time around, and especially someone who's so unique in the role from the outset. Timothy Dalton is a huge breath of fresh air for the series. Unlike Moore, who was known and occasionally infamous for his humorous approach, Dalton is much more serious in personality. His version of Bond doesn't mess around when it comes to getting the job done, and he becomes visibly frustrated when the mission doesn't go as planned. There's also little in the way of cheap gags or one-liners, and even when there is a funny little quip, it's usually a throwaway without much enthusiasm delivered. Dalton himself said that he based his portrayal of Bond on the novel version created by Fleming, opting to emulate a more hard-edged persona and emphasizing the danger of Bond's world of spies. While some people may not be a fan of the new approach and the lack of humor, I think it's a nice change of pace. It reminded me a lot of how Sean Connery started out in the franchise, especially with From Russia with Love. Sure, it had its fair share of action spectacles and funny scenes here and there, but it also remained the true example of a spy film where Bond has to investigate for clues in order to complete his mission. At the same time, Bond has to evade an enemy that's always on his trail, which meant that he was never safe. Dalton does a phenomenal job at highlighting the thrills and dangers of Bond's world once again. He may be a bit uptight as far as personality is concerned, but I think it still manages to come across well. I like to believe it's a drier version of already dry British humor, topped off with an air of dark intrigue and romantic swagger only Dalton can accomplish.
You were fantastic. We're free.
Cara, we're inside a Russian airbase in the middle of Afghanistan.
Now for the rest of the film. It starts, appropriately enough, with an MI6 training mission on the Rock of Gibraltar. After being debriefed by M, a group of 00 agents disembark to begin their training, but one of them is an assassin in disguise. He delivers a code phrase to Agent 004 before killing him by cutting his climbing rope, resulting in him falling to his death. We see Dalton's Bond introduced to us in this moment as he witnesses the death take place and proceeds to pursue the assassin. It's a lot more basic in scope compared to previous opening set pieces. There's not much in terms of explosions or any sort of fancy special effects, but what makes it work is the stunts. The whole sequence of events that happens in these few short minutes is breathtaking. It mostly happens in the confines of one vehicle, and yet they still make it work. Think about it, a duke out where Bond could get killed inside a moving vehicle that could crash with a package of explosives that's on fire. I get sweaty palms just thinking about it. But that's not even the best part. Reportedly, Dalton performed much of the film's stunts himself, which is just crazy to think about. When you see him hanging on the top of the assassin's vehicle for dear life, that's really him on there. I can only imagine how terrified Cubby must have been to see his leading man hanging on the edge like that. Everything is topped off with an explosive finale as Bond parachutes himself to safety, as well as a classic one-liner for good measure.
I need to use your phone. Should call you back.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond. Exercise Control 007 here. I'll report in an hour.
Won't you join me?
Better make that 2.
Immediately after this, the film's opening credits begin. This time, the title theme is performed by Norwegian pop group a-ha, famous for their hit song Take On Me. I'll admit that I wasn't a big fan of this song at first. Maybe I expected too much after Duran Duran nailed it with A View to a Kill, but it just feels slower and moodier than usual, though not quite as slow as those in Moore's previous films. But after listening to it enough times, it's finally grown on me. I love how peppy it is with its use of synthesizers and how it's all blended with John Barry's orchestra. It's a unique sound that reminds me of the opening theme from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, just in terms of how different types of instruments are used in combination with each other. But it's not just the theme that gets this treatment. Nearly every track in this film's soundtrack is loaded with synth elements fused along with a mighty brass and booming percussion section. This was the final Bond film in the series to be composed by John Barry, and man did he ever go out on a bang. Every song in this film stands out in its own way and is always appropriate in the mood of whatever scene is shown. I found myself listening to individual tracks from this film's soundtrack in my spare time along with my other music. It's that good. It's crazy to think how much different the series would have been if it weren't for John Barry's influence. As far as I'm concerned, this soundtrack is his magnum opus and a definitive representation of the legacy of Bond. John Barry, I salute you. After the opening credits, Bond receives a debriefing in which he must assist with the defection of a top Soviet officer named Georgy Koskov, played by Dutch actor Jeroen Krabbe. He attends an opera concert being held in Bratislava while on lookout and decides the cellist is more entertaining to watch, much to the chagrin of his co-worker. Eventually, Bond whips out the biggest sniper rifle I've ever seen and gets ready to set up and defend Koskov's escape. However, he notices the cellist from earlier who is seemingly ready to kill Koskov, which prompts Bond to disobey orders to kill the girl by shooting the gun out of her hands instead. After all this, Bond manages to smuggle Koskov out of the area and into Austria through the use of the Trans-Siberian pipeline. I'll admit the concept of sending a guy through a tube like this is a bit strange, but there are two funny things that make it hilarious for me. One is the girl who distracts the supervisor from watching Bond's actions on screen. I mean, what can I say? That is foolproof. The second occurs just before Koskov is sent out through the tube, and he questions Bond if this has been done before. Both Bond's dry and Koskov's panic reactions are priceless.
Relax, Yogi. Our engineers have spent months perfecting this.
How many times have you done this before?
You're the first.
Once Koskov is under the security of MI6, he explains to them that the KGB is reviving an old policy known as Smert Spionum, also known as Death of Spies, which is being directed by Soviet General Leonid Pushkin. It isn't long until Koskov is kidnapped and is soon to be taken back to Moscow, so M orders Bond to track down Pushkin at his safe house in Tangier and kill him by any means necessary. Before this, Bond takes a bit of a diversion and returns to Bratislava to investigate the cellist who attempted to kill Koskov. Things start to take off more story-wise once Bond locates the girl's apartment and properly introduces himself as a friend of Koskov, escorting her to Vienna in Austria. In turn, she introduces herself as Cara Milovi, who's played by Maryam Dabo. Cara is Koskov's girlfriend, who Bond learns that Koskov duped into faking his defection using blank rounds that were loaded into Cara's rifle. The reasons why are complicated, confusing, and better off discussing later in the review. For now, I'll just start by saying Cara is a great Bond girl. She's an innocent woman who wants nothing more than to practice her craft and play at Carnegie Hall, yet has the misfortune of crossing paths with Koskov and getting wrapped up in Bond's mission on top of it all. They could have easily hand-waved her musical skills off after one scene and not dwell on it any longer than that, but the film surprisingly goes in depth with her talent. There's more than a few scenes where we see her actually playing the cello, both when she's practicing and when she's performing. It adds a level of realism in her portrayal as a civilian who gets mixed up with a secret spy operation. I really like the relationship that develops between her and Bond. Although she's technically Koskov's girlfriend, Bond manages to win her over slowly but surely with his signature charm. The way Dalton's Bond holds and caresses Cara during the more quiet moments together reminds me a lot of how George Lazenby portrayed Bond in Love with Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The romance between Bond and Cara feels genuine in the same respect, though unlike the former film, Cara is very much more in love with Bond in this case. Maryam Dabo is fantastic in her performance as Cara, just in terms of the depth she adds to their romance. She gets worried for Bond when he shows up late for occasions, throws a frustrated temper at him when he asks her to escape to safety, and even follows him into danger despite being asked not to. Even though she has no idea what she's getting into, Cara will do anything if it means protecting the man she loves. On top of all this, I just think Cara is adorable. I love the way her hair spins every time she turns her head, and the humorously wholesome comments she makes. Her childlike naivete complements Bond's gruff persona extremely well, and the chemistry between the two actors make everything that much better. Definitely one of my favorite Bond girls to date.
What's that supposed to mean?
What kind of horse?
You're calling me a horse's ass.
There are other supporting characters as well that help Bond on his mission, including a new Moneypenny played by Caroline Bliss and Felix Leiter, making his first appearance since Live and Let Die, and surprise surprise, he's played by a different actor, this time by John Terry. We also get a group of villains in the form of not one or two, but three bad guys all cooperating with each other. I already mentioned Koskov and how he planned to fake his defection in order to carry out his evil plot, but that's just scraping the surface. Koskov works in tandem with his henchman Necros, played by Andrius Wisniewski, and with a black market arms dealer named Brad Whitaker, played by Joe Don Baker. Whitaker is an ex-mercenary who's obsessed with warfare, declaring himself to be a general of his own domain, and frequently staging mock battles with his own props and figurines. It's an amusing concept, but it doesn't really make me believe in him as a villain. He comes across as more of an eccentric oaf than a real menace. Bond could easily take this guy out in his sleep. Koskov arranges an arms deal with Whitaker to purchase weapons for the benefit of the Soviet military, while attempting to assassinate Pushkin, who's head of the KGB, and canceling the purchase of the firearms. While I like the realistic approach to the evil plot, it still comes across as a bit tame. I'm not a firearms expert by any means, but I would imagine these kinds of arms deals take place all the time in the real world. If it hadn't been for 00 agents dying and the whole smeared spionem bit at the beginning, which raised the ire of MI6, there wouldn't have been any point in investigating. And it's certainly not helped by the fact that these villains just don't have any notable presence about them. There are a few fun scenes where Necros gets to shine as the skilled assassin and master of disguise that he is, but that's about it. There is a lot of potential to be found in these villains, but their execution leaves a lot to be desired.
How do you like my personal pantheon of great commanders?
Butchers.
Surgeons. They cut away society's dead flesh. Let me show you something.
Alright, let's explore some of the biggest highlights this film has going for it. I already talked at length about most of the characters, so let's shift focus onto the action. Personally, I feel that The Living Daylights is the biggest step up in the series at this point when it comes to the advancement of special effects. There are many sequences in this film that practically left me with heart palpitations when it was all said and done. The best example in this regard is when Dalton's Bond flies off with a plane of opium in an attempt to destroy the payload. More on that later. Koskov's henchman Necro secretly boards the plane and attempts to kill Bond. It's an ordinary brawl at first glance, but it's the variables at play that make it classic. Bond is in danger of being killed by 4 things the entire time the fight takes place. 1, he could get killed by Necros. 2, the bomb inside the plane could explode at any minute. 3, Cara's lack of flying experience could result in a crash. 4, Bond could fall off the plane to his death. There are so many elements of danger present on screen, all without the use of any guns or gadgets, and the result is absolutely nerve-wracking. To this day, my heart races anytime the scene pops into my head. In general, the film feels like it has a more refined quality to it than others in the past. The action scenes just feel punchier and more tightly edited in the way they're presented. The ice chase is another great showcase of how all the elements come together to make a great set piece. Bond and Cara have to evade the KGB while he attempts to escort her to Vienna under the guise of meeting Koskov. The chase features another one of Q's latest toys in the form of the Aston Martin V8 Vantage, and it's filled to the brim with all kinds of fun stuff. Or, as Bond prefers to call them,
what is this?
I've had a few optional extras installed.
Seriously, this scene is so much fun to watch. It's packed with metal-cutting lasers, heat-seeking missiles, and on top of that, it can cover just about any terrain thrown at it. Some of the best car stunts in the whole series are shown in this one bit, especially when the car circles around the lake and Bond makes idiots out of the local police. Every vehicle stunt is beautifully choreographed once again by Remy Julien, returning from A View to a Kill, and I just love how there's so much open space dedicated to showing the action in Bond's world. Even when there are no vehicles, the visuals are still spectacular. Whether they involve Bond and Cara tumbling down the Austrian countryside on a cello case, or storming the Afghan desert with a band of rebels, every shot is carefully layered with enough artistic merit without getting in the way of the story. And I know I'm about to repeat myself, but Dalton is just so good as Bond. He's so fixated on fulfilling his own goals that he's willing to disregard MI6 protocol in front of another staff member. It just cracks me up every time I see the looks on their faces. He still manages to be humorous in certain situations, but his one-liners and remarks aren't done out of amusement so much as they are used to deal with stressful situations. This trait helps Dalton balance the tightrope between fantasy and realism, and he manages to effectively appeal to the best of both worlds.
Doc! We've nothing to declare!
Well, now that I've put it off long enough, let's talk about the problems I do have with this film. Honestly, there aren't many issues in The Living Daylights that bother me a whole lot, but one thing that still leaves me confused to this day is the story. Now, I don't mind the fact that the film opted for a more realistic storyline this time around, since it's not the first time a film in the franchise has done this. Rather, it has to do with how many layers are involved in it, specifically in how needlessly complex the villain's evil plot is. I can understand Koskov's whole faking defection bit so that he can plan something more nefarious under everyone's noses, but the sequence of events leading to his plot leaves his motivations muddled and difficult to follow. In a nutshell, Koskov fakes his defection from the Soviet Union to feed MI6 a false lead by making them think that the KGB's leader Pushkin is the one organizing the killing of its spies. He then fakes a kidnapping from MI6 so he can proceed to the next step of his plans. Meanwhile, Pushkin rebukes Whitaker's attempts to sell firearms to his country, which is what Koskov wants in order to strengthen his country's military. Koskov then plots to kill Pushkin while embezzling state funds so he can proceed to obtain the weapons unobstructed, which Bond carries out instead of him, albeit undercover, so Koskov doesn't know Pushkin isn't really dead. Then he plans to provide a payload of diamonds in exchange for a ton of opium from Afghan jihadists so that he can sell it and keep the profits with enough money left to supply his military with Whitaker's weapons while returning the state funds unnoticed. Trying to make sense of all this in my first time watching this was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. For a goal so simple at first glance, it has way too many factors going on in the background that ruin the flow of it all, and make it hard to concentrate on what exactly is being accomplished on screen.
I'm sorry, James. For you I have great affection. But we've an old saying. Duty has no sweethearts.
We have an old saying too, Yogi. And you're full of it.
It makes even less sense when the leader of the Mujahideen decides to take matters in his own hands. He accepts the diamonds from Kozkov and provides the opium to him as planned, only for Cara to make a split-second decision to try and rescue Bond on her own. And what does this guy say in response to her actions?
Wait a minute.
Yep, that's all you need to have a change of heart. Just have a woman hurt your ego. I'm not sure why the writers felt the need to make the story so complicated in scope. It sort of reminds me of From Russia with Love in terms of the story threads being weaved, but that film handled them much better by comparison. The main goal for Bond in that film was to smuggle the Lecter out of Istanbul and bring it to MI6. Now I know there's a lot more to it than that, but when you get right down to it, that's the basic gist. Characters like Rosa Klebb and Red Grant were duplicitous in their operations, but it was all centered on one goal, obtaining the Lecter. Even though the series of events in it had a lot of backstory and little details behind them, the overall premise was solid enough that it was easy to stay focused on the central goal of the story. With The Living Daylights, I didn't really have an idea of what the premise was, at least not in my first time watching it. And even knowing it now after the fact, I can't help but feel underwhelmed. Stopping an arms sale isn't exactly the most pressing matter to address in a Cold War, and making the story so convoluted and centered around lackluster villains doesn't do it any favors for it either. The message behind it makes sense now that I understand it years later, but I'd have preferred if they kept things simple, or simple as possible anyway.
Put him on the next plane to Moscow.
Oh, thank you, General. Thank you so much. Thank you.
In the diplomatic bag.
In the end though, it doesn't really matter. When it's all said and done, The Living Daylights is a classic spy film and one of the greatest of its kind. Dalton's take on Bond was the shot in the arm this franchise needed to kick things into high gear again. Even though he was more serious in nature, he took the role in stride and pulled off a unique take on Bond that hasn't been replicated since. But the film's strengths go beyond just having a new Bond. It has a believable romance and likable Bond girl, some of the most impressive action set pieces and stunt work you've ever seen, and John Barry turns in one more final explosive soundtrack that ends up being the best of his whole career. Even with its uninspired baddies plotting along with their evil plans, the film still manages to carry on, firing on all cylinders without a hitch. It's one of those movies that you're better off not thinking too much about and just letting it happen. Hey, don't take my word for it, Bond said it best.
Don't think. Just let it happen.
At the end of the day, films like these are meant to be entertaining. If you can accept the jumbled nature of its story and don't mind the long runtime, then you'll be in for more than a treat. You'll get to experience one of the most relentlessly fun movies you've ever seen. But you better brace yourself for the next film in the series, because it just might scare the living daylights out of you. This concludes my review of The Living Daylights. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, stay tuned for the next part.
You didn't think I'd miss this performance, did you?
If there was a man I could dream of.
I've had a few optional extras installed.